This is my first time doing all of this different stuff here. My first time being back in like any kind of a group setting like this since all of this began. I preached right before coronavirus shut everything down, and here I am opening things back up at a different church prior, and here we are again. It is, man, it's fun to be with you. So I'm glad to be back with you, and welcome back to those of you made the trek out to join us. As was already shared, my name is Josh. I'm married to my lovely wife Allie, and we are together starting a church in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston in partnership with Converge Northeast, of which we're so excited to be kind of walking along this journey together with you here at EBC. It's good to be with you. It's good to honored by the invitation by Pastor Pete, and just honored by the opportunity to open God's Word for you this morning. You know, it is. There's something joyful, at least for me, I hope for you, I imagine for you as well, in the ability to be actually present with other people. I don't know about you. I'm mad extroverted, guys, and like over the last couple of months, just like my wife loves it. My wife is great with it. She could continue to do isolation and coronavirus indefinitely. But me though, I miss my people. I miss getting to be with people. I miss the local coffee shops in our neighborhood in Dorchester. I miss the restaurants. I miss going on a run with my run crew. There's so many things in this season that we've been doing without. And I've just noticed that from a space of grief, from a space of longing, man, there's a lot of longing. There's a lot of desires that we've been in this season. And then now as we're beginning to come out, get a bit of a breath of the outside world, it's still incomplete, isn't it? I mean, I'm the lucky one. This is a great time to recruit for the worship ministry, brother. I think the selling point is just you get to not have your mask on, right? But I mean, still, we're not able to hug each other. We're not able to embrace fully. We're wearing these masks. And so we're in this kind of liminal space in between where we're beginning to step back into some of those things that we're really hoping for, and yet still in so many ways carrying this longing. And really, I want to speak to you in part this morning about this longing for change. Because I think that we're in a moment right now where there's frankly a lot wrong with the world. You know, wherever you look, and I'm sure for each of us, we may be drawn to, we may see different experiences of it, different aspects or dimensions of it. But man, there's a lot that's a mess right now. You know, from coronavirus, obviously, and infecting and ravaging folks. My dad, thank God, just recovered, but we've lost a family member already to coronavirus. We know a number of people who've been sick. I'm sure you do too. To the scourge of racism and racial violence and the unrest as a result of that, and the back and forth and the division that we've seen over these past few weeks. There's so much these things that are so visibly on the surface that are just really not right with the world. There's a lot that's a mess right now. And you know, it makes me think of in Scripture when the Apostle Paul talked about in Romans chapter 8, he said, you know, we know the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. And he's talking about the return of Christ, the manifestation when all these things that are wrong will be set right. Even the earth itself is kind of groaning under the weight of everything that is wrong. All of this longing. You know, it's interesting. I think these longings, this intuition that something is off, that something isn't okay, is actually points us to a reality that there's a different way in which the world is, different way in which God has designed things to be. Right? And deep inside of us, we have this internal longing that calls to us, that speaks to us when we see coronavirus, when we see racism, when we see sickness and division and gridlock in Washington, when we see all of these different things around us, whether it's just down the street in our relationship with our neighbors or some of these big global issues, there's something inside us that calls to us and said, you know, that's not right. That's not how things ought to be. Sometimes we have an intuition, a longing together even with the earth for the coming kingdom. So as we jump in this morning, I'd love to just ask you even to consider, what kind of longing are you bringing in this morning? Seriously, what are you longing for? What's the hope there? What's the desire that's deep inside your soul that you're yearning for? Maybe it's to be able to see an elderly or immunocompromised relative. Maybe it's to be able to just go eat at your favorite place without a mask on and without all these restrictions. Right? Maybe it's justice. Maybe it's a change of something in Washington in one way or another. Maybe it's to get pregnant or to get your kids into the school or to be able to buy a house, to be able to find the job that will allow you to really contribute in the way that you believe you were designed to. I don't know, what is it for you? Do you have something in your mind? Go ahead and grab hold of that this morning. What are you longing for? You know, I think so much of our longing is good and holy, is given by God, is important. You know, we're in a space of dreaming, of longing up in Dorchester. As my wife and I have begun this journey of starting a new church community. It's kind of a crazy adventure that we're on, rallying people and saying, hey, do you want to go with us along this journey? Reaching out to non-Christian friends and neighbors and saying, hey, do you think maybe you'd be willing to take a chance on Jesus? We believe that he has the life and the hope and the salvation that you're really looking for, rather than all of these other places and ways in which you're chasing these things. You know, we're inviting people into vision, whether it's non-Christians into relationship with Jesus, whether it's Christians into a new kind of startup community, based on a belief that we're going somewhere, that we're creating something. It's a space full of longing. And you know, we're longing not just to kind of gather a group of people, but really, we've got big dreams. We want to see a movement of microchurches in Dorchester, a group of people rallied together in communities that are extending the love of Jesus into every neighborhood, into every network in our community. We want to see impacts socially. The end of racism. We're in one of the most diverse zip codes in the entire country. Black and white and brown, and we've got a ton of Vietnamese folk. We're just this beautiful mix of diversity, and we're trying to figure out how to live life together well as a community. We want to see those relationships restored and those divisions healed. Man, I get upset when I hear the black mamas in our community who call me and say, man, I'm just so worried for my son right now. I'm so worried that he's going to be misperceived and somehow that he might not make it through to adulthood. I'm so grieved about the families in our community who are out of work right now in the lower socioeconomic community and are wondering whether they'll be able to stay in their homes, stay in their communities. I'm grieved by these things, and I'm longing for the church to make a difference in some of these things. For us to be the kind of community that could bring healing, that could bring justice. But more than anything, more than social change, friends, I'm longing for spiritual change, because I believe that that's really where it starts. We're starting a church with a vision to train and to mobilize communities of Christians to extend Jesus' love into every neighborhood in Dorchester. I want to see, there's 127,000 people in our neighborhood, just in our neighborhood. And we want to see every man, woman, and child have repeated opportunities to experience and accept the love of Jesus Christ. I believe that that's where the transformation starts. More than anything, that's what I'm longing for. You know, I believe generally that our longings, as we think about these things, so often our longings aren't too big. They're actually, I think, too small. We got caught up on longings for a nice vacation or, the right house or this or that or the other thing. And none of those things are bad. I'm not against any of that. But I think God has wired in us something deeply for us to dream, to be a part of the renewal of the world that he's calling us into. You know, throughout history, the church has been really an engine for change. You know, right now we're in the midst of this pandemic, but if you look back into church history, we see in the 4th century, there was a plague that hit the city of Caesarea. The populace was already decimated from famine and war and really unable to withstand this additional blow. People began fleeing the city, trying to get away, trying to distance from this ravaging things into the safety of the countryside. But there was one group that stayed back, that stayed in the city, that plugged in. And Eusebius, the bishop at the time, records in his church history that during the plague, all day long, the Christians tended to the dying, to their burial. Countless numbers with no one to care for them. Others gathered together from all parts of the city, a multitude of those withered from famine, and distributed bread to them all. In these moments of crisis, in these moments of pandemic throughout the history of the church, we really see Christians being first responders, moving not away from the difficulties, but towards these places of brokenness, these places of desperation, and being agents of healing. In fact, church historian Rodney Stark has studied the rise of Christianity through the first 300 years, and he says, one of the key factors in the rise and growth of the church was plagues. It was plague because there was this time when everything was falling apart, and the one group that had the boldness and the courage to move towards these things, whose lives became so radically reshaped by the love of Jesus Christ, that everyone saw this powerful witness to the gospel. It took the Christian movement from a group of just a few people, an obscure and marginal sect on the outside, the fringes of society, to 6 million believers in 300 years. Exponential, radical, unbelievable growth because the way in which the people of God stepped up in a moment of crisis. Of course, the church as an engine for change didn't start then. It has continued up even until this present day. More recently in our own country's history, we see as we're confronted right now on the surface with racism and racial violence and racial division in our country. The church hasn't always been on the right side of any of these things, but when we look at really who has helped to spearhead some of these movements, again, the church was right there. I was amazed this week as I was actually looking into some of these things. Wikipedia says Christians have been at the forefront of the abolition and civil rights movement. You go back to Christians in England like William Wilberforce, preachers here in the United States like Charles Finney, who preached vehemently against slavery and helped to initiate and organize the abolitionist movement here in the United States. And then, of course, we fast forward and we all know about Martin Luther King and his activism and advocacy for civil rights, but so often his name is thrown around these days and people forget that the man was a Baptist preacher. Before they were marching in the streets, they were praying together in churches just like this one, calling for justice based on the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament, inviting people into action, nonviolent action based on the example of Jesus Christ. Throughout history, we see that the Church of Jesus Christ has been an engine for change, social and spiritual. Even here in the book of Ephesians, where we're going to camp out this morning, we see that right here that the gospel of Jesus Christ was already changing the world. We see the first multi-ethnic movement in the history of the world happen in the book of Acts. As the church bridges Jew and Gentile, instead of sects, instead of tribes, instead of groups segregated by their ethnicity and culture, we see Jew and Gentile, these groups with so much hostility, so much animosity, so much political and cultural and social difference, being brought together by the blood of Christ. Ephesians talks about the hostility being broken down, the wall being bridged, as these groups that detested each other found one another, became family through the death of Jesus Christ. You get my point. I could go on and on all day about this, but throughout the history of our country, throughout the history of the world, we've seen the gospel of Jesus Christ be an engine for change, and the church move forward in these moments. And I think that's so important for us right now as we stand on this precipice, this clearly tumultuous time. Friends, everything is up in the air. The world is changing. It's not going back to where it was before. Where will we be in this process? I believe the gospel has the power to generate a community that reconciles divisions, heals ills, and transforms the world. And not just broadly, because, it's easy to think about like the church, but I'm talking about you, friends. Like I'm talking about you personally. Where's that longing in you? What are you hoping for? Where are you maybe invited to be part of that renewal? Let's look at our text together in Ephesians chapter 5. I'm going to pick up here in verse number 1. Ephesians 5, picking up in verse number 1. The Apostle Paul tells us, of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love just as Christ loved us and gave himself for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Did you catch that, friends? See, we're going to spend some time in this text this morning, but the first thing that I want you to notice, life of radical, self-giving, sacrificial, transformational love isn't just some superhero feat. Paul says this isn't just something for Jesus. This isn't just something for pastors like Pete or Josh. He says, live a life of love us and gave himself for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice. What would it look to love that way? A sacrificial, fragrant offering, sacrifice. That's our mission really at the table. We talk about it in terms of a community learning to live and love like Jesus. A community learning to live and love like Jesus. It's what we're inviting people into in their daily lives, and we're seeing some fruits of that. I'm excited to share even a little bit more of that here in a minute. But before I do, I want to be realistic, because maybe some of you have said, man, you're young and this is beautiful and that sounds great, right? But like, I've lived in the real world for a minute. These things are, that's a little bit pie in the sky, right? Because here's the thing. I know that anytime we go after these longings, we hit obstacles, right? We hit some challenges and some problems. I mean, the table, this vision we had, man, we had a good plan. We knew how things were going to go. This September, we were going to have a grand opening. All spring and summer, we had, some teams lined up to come in and help us. We had outreach events planned. Before this actually started, we were doing all sorts of cool outreaches that were beginning to get traction in the community. I think we've got a slide here of a few of those different events. We were hosting benefit concerts and workshops in the community. We were hosting different community events and dinners and things like that. And we had a number of people coming together, people beginning to be curious and excited and get together, and then guess what? COVID hit. And none of that can happen, right? We're all stuck on Zoom. It's just not the same, right? It's not the same. So we had all these beautiful plans and vision for just how this was going to go, and then, boy, did we hit a wall. Like this 2020, man, Kobe died and things have just gone downhill from there. It has been a year, hasn't it? Right? This has not gone how we had hoped it would. We've had, no personal gatherings for months at this point. We've had people from our community, dear core members, parts of our planting team, lose work and move out of state. Honestly, at times, the last few months have been discouraging. It's been hard. This is a hard time to maintain something, let alone start something. This is a crappy season for that. So, as we're going after vision, after we're going after longing, I don't know that COVID always comes up, but there's always something, isn't there? I mean, maybe you relate to this in your own life. I can't tell you how many times I've said, man, I'm going to lose some weight, right? I get on that train, I'm like exercising, I'm counting calories, I'm managing my portion control, I'm doing all the things, and then, I'll tell you what, I have some willpower, and for a few months, things are going great. And then, I don't know, it's always something different. There's a project I get stressed out about, something else steals my attention away, and before long, right, I just get distracted. I get offline. I start eating poorly again. I start going in the wrong direction. It's so easy to get discouraged. We find into this pattern. Maybe you've experienced it too. A burst of energetic work followed by a crisis. Then there's distraction and disappointment, and then we end up feeling stuck in apathy and shame. Right? I tried it, I went after it, I hit the obstacle, man, this didn't go how I hoped. And man, now I'm just embarrassed that I even went after this. You know, this vision, trying to reach 127,000 people with repeated opportunities to experience and accept the gospel of Jesus, it's a big vision. We weren't going to go after that. We weren't ever going to go there without hitting some obstacles along the way. Now, I wonder if maybe you've experienced this problem too, or this cycle. Whether you're trying to start a movement or whether you're just trying to drop 10 pounds, right? I feel like we run into this. And I'm not saying this so that after the gathering that you'll give me some weight loss tips. Please don't. Or so that you'll give me a hug because I'm so discouraged. I'm saying it because I think this is common to how we often end up. Often we get stuck here. But friends, I think this is important. This is important to us because if you find yourself today, we can end up in one of two ditches. On the one side, I think we end up in a ditch that I'll call settling. We come to kind of an apathy and a cynicism. Our dreams feel too big. They feel scary. So instead, we drop those expectations. We drop those longings down to something that's more manageable. Right? Because how many of you get that to really hope for something big? It opens you up to disappointment. Right? It's scary. Maybe you listen to me talk about this grand vision for social and spiritual transformation and you're just rolling your eyes and being like, okay. Right? I get it. It is easier to settle for cynicism of being right about how a vision will fail than it is to risk doing something great. Brene Brown says, hope takes a helmet. Man, I think that's right. It is scary. It's scary to go after something that might disappoint us. So how does that relate to your story? Where have you maybe lost some hope, lost some of that fervor, lost that momentum for what you thought God might be able to do through you? Where have you lowered those expectations and that longing? Settle. But on the other side, there's not only the ditch of settling, there's also the ditch of striving. And frankly, sometimes I think, hop back and forth. Like I spend barely any time on the road. I'll go back and forth between these ditches sometimes, to be honest with you. And I don't know about here in your community. I could say up in Boston, probably the striving ditch is where most of my folks spend more of their time. And if the one side puts us in apathy and cynicism, when we veer off the road into striving, we end up in anxiety and burnout. We're trying to manufacture change out of our own resources. And if we've got to manufacture that, if we've got to be the engine for change, oh man, that's a burden to bear. The only way to go after something big and grand if we're striving is to live beyond our limits. To put all this pressure on our shoulders. And every time we end up in anxiety and burnout. Some of you may have heard me talk about this grand vision and just be assumed like, well, you're talking about that. That doesn't sound like a lot of fun. I'd prefer to, not be all stressed out. I get it. This ditch of striving is exhausting. We see the symptoms all over our culture. Exhaustion, overwhelm, indebtedness. Settling isn't the answer, but neither is striving. Neither lead to transformational change in the way of Jesus. Both will lead us empty. But here's my core assertion to you this morning. I think we'll never generate the kind of change that Jesus generated when we try and do it on our own. In order to make the transformational change, that we've got to tap into his, we've got to learn to live and love like he did. It's the only way to avoid both of these ditches. And this engine for change actually is right here in Ephesians chapter 5 and verses 1 and 2. See, because Paul doesn't just call us to live and love like Jesus, but here in verses 1 and 2, he actually gives us the schematics of this engine for change.
And the first thing he starts with is the motive. That motive is in our newfound identities. Now, identity is an interesting thing. After all, who are you? Now, some of you are completely seated by yourself, but most of you are here with some family folk or somebody. So if you're by yourself, shout at somebody, but I want you to turn to somebody and just in the next 5 seconds, without using your name, I want you to tell a person near you or next to you who you are. Ready? All right, go. You got it? What did you say? Who are you? Right now, this is not one of those trick questions where there's like only one right answer and then I'm going to play a gotcha here. There are lots of pieces, there are lots of facets to our identity. Perhaps somebody shared your job or your status in relationship as a husband or a wife or a parent or a child. But Paul gives the Ephesian church here an identity that's a motive for this kind of love. He calls them dearly loved children in verse number 1 here of Ephesians chapter 5. Dearly loved children. Think about that. Who's the best dad that you know? Who's the best dad that you know? I mean, I probably go with my dad. He's awesome. But, I've got this image in my head of his dad, our wedding. I think we got a picture of it there on the screen. I'll never forget his face. This is actually, I wasn't viewing him at this time, but he had that exact look on his face a whole bunch of times at our weddings. And he had this smile on his face that was so big that you thought his whole face was going to split open. Just a warmth that radiated from every pore as he looked at his daughter with a heart of love. You just knew that he would do anything for her, that he loved her with that kind of a love. And friends, what if we imagined that God really felt that way about us? As dearly loved children. In our call to worship, we talked about God leaving the 99 and going after the one. We talked about this reckless love of God. But how do you experience God? How do you relate to God in your soul? Is that how you imagine him? Is that how you relate to him like that? Is that how you think of God's relationship to you or to your neighbor across the street? That person who irritates you, who is different from you. Friends, I believe that the start of the engine for transformation is a shift in our identity, and that's really the motive this morning. It's tapping into this powerful, this overwhelming love of God. A God who delights in us, whose heart is full of wonder, full of love. See, this is the starting point. When Paul begins this text, he doesn't say, hey friends, you got to love your neighbor as yourself. You got to give more generously. You've got to volunteer at least once a quarter. He starts by saying you need to be imitators of God as dearly loved children. And I think this is important, friends, because this is what keeps us out of the striving or the settling ditch, is relating to God as a father who sees us as his dearly loved children. See, we have to, in order to extend God's love, we've got to encounter God's love. We've got to be receiving it daily, not just on Sundays, spending time in the presence of God. If we haven't accepted and experienced, if we haven't ourselves been changed by the radical love of God for us, then inevitably, when we try and extend that out into the world, it's going to be impotent, or we're going to end up striving. We're going to end up exhausted and in burnout. And friends, this is good news because the love of God is a resource for change. So many of us, and oftentimes, to be honest with you, this is true of myself, but man, in this big vision, trying to hold on to to seeing transformation occur, we end up hustling, we end up competing, we end up burning the candle at both ends. We want to change the world, we want to change ourselves, so we try and we exert our wills and we go after it, and then we just end up tired. And for some of you, that's where you're at today. This morning, you've come to believe that what you're supposed to do if you're to be a Christian, if you're to be a good person, is to strive. Is to really work, to white knuckle it, to buckle down and work really, really hard. And friends, that's a dead-end road. I'm not saying that you shouldn't get in shape or love your neighbor or give generously. What I'm saying is that drive can't come from an energy that is internal to you, that you're manufacturing it, trying to force it. It comes from abiding in the overwhelming, transforming love of God. It starts with worship. It starts with prayer. It starts with the presence of God in our lives. As we begin to get a vision of how radically and how deeply and how affectionately God loves us, it begins to change us. It begins to transform us. And this is the good news, friends. In verse number 2, it says, Christ loved us. He gave himself for us. We've got the proof. We've got the proof of how much God loves us. In Jesus, he suffered the consequences for all of our screw-ups, for all of our inadequacies, for all of our laziness even. God isn't waiting to love you till you get your life together, until you get to that point of perfection. In Romans, Paul says that while we were still even in this posture of enemies towards God, that he loved us. God's love will transform us. But the love of God isn't just the motive for change, but friends, it's also, I believe, the map for change. The map for change, because we also see here in this text that he says to be imitators of God. See, through Jesus, God invites you into a relationship as a dearly loved child, a transformation that shifts our identity. But these verses point not only to where we're going, but also how to get there. It says, be imitators of God. Live a life of love. And this is the crazy thing about Jesus. See, Jesus' love isn't just the motive for us. It's both the resource that fills us up, that allows us to love others, and it's also the map. His life is both motive and map for transformation. So if you're trying to figure out in your life, what does this actually look like? How do you do this? Paul gives us the answer right here. He says the answer is imitation. By living just as Christ loved us. And after all, this is how any beloved kid relates to their dad, right? Or to their mom. Right, I've got some nephews that live not too far from here, and man, they will imitate anything you do. It is a scary thing, man. Don't say the wrong thing, don't do the wrong thing, because then that vocabulary, it sticks forever, right? You know, they're just going to say it over and over again. Right? And that's the beautiful thing about little kids is they look at their caregivers, they look at those people that love them, and they see how they act and they imitate it. So that's what we're called to. That's what we're invited to. This is the map for transformation. Imitating our Father who is revealed to us in Jesus. Learning to encounter him, the motive, being filled to the brim of overflowing with his affection for us, and then imitating him. Trying to love others as he did. Can you imagine how different that works out, friends? I mean, this paradigm shift will really... I'm still trying to get it in my soul. It's not a one-time thing, but the paradigm shift will change your life. I mean, just even think about, to go back to that weight loss conversation earlier. This is something I'm learning right now and starting to lose a little bit of weight, I think. But you just relate with yourself differently when you're in a posture of, man, I'm embarrassed and I'm ashamed about the way my body is, and so I'm going to try and beat myself up into working out, into eating, to kind of pummel my body into change, versus when you begin to graciously and generously accept yourself and say, hey, I actually want to do this from a place of affection because this is taking care of myself. It's a small thing, it's a subtle thing, but that shift makes all the difference. And I'm not just talking about weight loss here, I'm talking about the everyday of your life, the way you relate to your neighbor. right? If that person is a jerk, you're going to have a hard time summoning up the willpower because you should. But if you soak in the transforming love of God for you, you could begin to that, even to somebody who's a hot mess, even to somebody who doesn't in themselves deserve it, because you know you don't either, right? It changes everything. We're seeing a lot of that change work out in our community up in Dorchester. It's so beautiful. Right now, I'm speaking here with you, and I'm so excited. I'm going to go watch the recording as soon as I get off because there's a Sunday gathering happening just with our little planting team. We haven't gone public yet, but our community is leading that. There's several people stepping into speaking for the first time, doing a teaching, doing coaching with each other, leading prayer, leading different elements in the absence of. So your pastor's away, you got somebody else in. Our community's stepping up too in various ways. I'm so proud of what God's doing in them. One story that really kind of drives this home for me is with my now friend, Leon. Back just before the pandemic hit, this is my buddy Leon here. He's grown up, raised in Dorchester, and works in state government. And back before the pandemic hit, actually back to September, I bumped into him in a local coffee shop, and we started a conversation. And I was talking with him about, honestly, what I'm talking with you guys about today. He said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Well, we're trying to start this church." He was like, "Oh, I didn't know that. I knew you as a neighbor here in the community. I didn't know that you guys were starting a church." I said, "Yeah, our mission is to train people to live and love like Jesus, and we believe that this is the engine for real change. I know you work in government, and you're up against a lot of opposition, a lot of challenges there. I imagine that a lot of folks in your space may experience burnout and cynicism as they hit these obstacles. And we believe that as we're trying to go after some big things in our own space, that really the love of Jesus is the engine for that." He said, "Wow, that's really interesting. I never thought about that before." So about a month later, he came to our gatherings. Ended up crying and sharing some that the resistance he was facing was so much deeper even than I imagined or knew. Leon's from the Haitian community, and man, there was some mess going on, like the spiritual stuff there, the resistance that he was facing, and voodoo and some things like that was really intense. So we prayed over him, spent time together. A few months after that, we were starting a new expression of the table in January. And I reached out to Leon and I said, "Hey, man, would you be interested in being part of this?" And honestly, in the back of my mind, I'm like, I have no idea where Leon is at spiritually at this point. I don't know if this dude's a Christian or not. But I said, "Hey, we're starting this new microchurch community. Would you be interested in being part of it?" And he said, "That's actually really interesting. I feel like I really could use some support right now." So he jumped in. Over the last couple of months, we've been kind of walking together as pandemic has hit, as racism has hit. In some of these ways, having conversations about how the love of Jesus can fuel us, can recharge us. And man, it has been so cool to see this man begin to have his eyes open up spiritually. I should know the date off the top of my head, I don't. But the date that this picture was taken was maybe a month and a half ago. I was like, "Man, Leon, I'd love to just sit down with you and have a chat about kind of where you're at spiritually. As we've been talking about encountering the love of Jesus, let's have a conversation." So we sat down, we talked, masks and all that. And I said, "Man, are you like have you accepted the love of Jesus? Have you received his love?" And he said, "Man, I like have some Catholic background, I got some voodoo background, but I don't really know that I've ever made that step." I said, "Man, do you want to?" And I'll be honest with you, at the time he said no. And then he came back and he was like, "Yeah, man, I think I do." So just a couple weeks ago, Leon prayed to receive Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. We got a baptism happening 2 weeks from today. Our first baptism at the table. And it's been such a blessing, so encouraging as we've seen people begin to internalize more deeply this love and then step out extending it. Being willing to start spiritual conversations with people that they're not all the way comfortable with. Being willing to have the conversation with the annoying neighbor who always parks incorrectly or lights up fireworks in the middle of And there's a lot of, I don't know if you guys have the fireworks thing going on there. It's a whole thing in Dorchester. But instead of moving from boundaries, from resentment, from complaint, beginning to move from the love of Jesus, beginning to imagine, what if God actually, what if that's a dearly loved child of God waiting to come home? And so we're seeing it happen. We're seeing some people begin to come home. And friends, I can't tell you how exciting it is to be part of that. And I share this both because we're excited about what's happening in Dorchester, but also, friends, because this applies to you. This is available to you. See, you are someone who God really loves. And whether you have been a believer for many times or you, like Leon, hadn't yet crossed that bridge of faith, it's available to you to experience the love of God even today in a fresh way, to accept that love, to be transformed by it, and then to extend it to others. So friends, as we close this morning, I just want to invite you to consider, how might this posture shift really change things for you? How would it reorient your love? How might it sustain your love? How might it deepen your love today? If instead of trying to strive or instead of settling, you allowed that longing to live in you, to move out through the power, through this engine for change of a transforming love as a dearly loved child and extended it to others. This morning, do you relate with the settling? Have you kind of said, I'm just going to keep expectations low, not get hurt? That ministry stuff is for somebody else. Or maybe you're on the other side. Maybe you're burnt out this morning. Maybe you've been for everything that you have and you're just tired. Friends, either way, the love of Christ is the answer for you. Would you pray with me? Oh, Abba, you have changed us with your reckless love. A love that would not let us be. A love that pursued us even to the end. A love that pursued us even when we were yet enemies. So this morning, I pray that we would taste it more deeply. That we drink it in, experiencing it for what it is. And that we would not be the same, but that we'd go forth extending it to all we meet. It's in your precious, powerful, loving name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Josh. Would you please